let's pick up where we left off yesterday. Nigel Farage is back.
Shazam! Bang.
Shazam! 4 o'clock yesterday.
There are people still around who say this is a rather boring election campaign. Nigel Farage, of course, being one of them. I think it is the reverse of boring. I'm obsessed by these polling leads that Labour's got, waiting for them day after day after day to sharply narrow, and if anything, they widen. I think this is the most extraordinary election any of us have lived through. And certainly the arrival of Nigel Farage seems to put a lid on any residual fading hopes the Tories had of being anything other than, to use a word I like, mollicated.
Really? I mean, it's that bad. You wrote for the New Statesman that the Tories should be terrified now.
They should be absolutely terrified. Not because, of course, under our voting system, Reform UK will win many seats. It's possible that Nigel Farage won't even win in Clacton, though I think he probably will. Lee Anderson, Ashfield, possibly 2 seats in total. But the real story will be the number of votes they get. Nigel Farage said yesterday that he thought they would have more votes than the Conservatives. Reform UK would beat the Conservatives in numbers of votes. Now, if that happened, I think, we do start to ask questions about the future of the Conservative Party. They're clearly at that point a party only held together or held in any parliamentary position by our rather strange electoral system.
But this idea that Nigel Farage will somehow take over the Tory party. I mean, I find it really odd. I mean, Kemi Badenoch, for all her critics, made out yesterday, why would we welcome someone in who says they want to destroy us? And he continues with that line, doesn't he?
I was talking to a former cabinet minister a couple of days ago who said, look, you have to understand, first of all, that if Nigel Farage arrives in the House of Commons, having helped Labour to take out another 100 or so of our MPs, we will absolutely hate him. There'll be a few Tories, who go and say hello in the bar and chuckle with him, but most of us will really hate him. And also remember what he has said himself. He loathes the Conservative Party. He thinks they're a deceitful, disgraceful shower, and he wants nothing to do. So it's got a very strange kind of marriage where both parties loathe the other, but are nonetheless going to cohabit. It doesn't seem to work to me.
Just to put the counterpoint to that, MPs did not like Boris Johnson. They hated Boris Johnson. He was everything that they despised, but they saw him as an election winner. I think if Nigel Farage does an extremely good job in the next 5 weeks, whatever their reservations about him, they might go, OK, the only way in which we can save the Conservative Party is by bringing him on board.
Freddie, you very elegantly put me in my place. Very sage point. That's well put.
Just before looking at sort of the politics of it, though, I mean, it's quite extraordinary what happened yesterday in terms of democracy, isn't it? I mean, Reform is not a political party. And what we saw, almost akin to a coup, really. We have Nigel Farage, it's a private company. He was a 53% owner, if you like, and has effectively shoved Richard Tice out and taken over. There's been no checks and balances in any way.
Richard Tice, who's put a huge amount of his own money into Reform UK and has been doing the long slog, the hard yards. I thought the body language and the words between Tice and Farage were not particularly warm, not particularly friendly. And when Tice went on and on and on about how thrilled he was that this was happening, I thought he protests too much.
I completely agree. But I don't think it matters that much. Many people have been associating the Reform Party with Nigel Farage for a very long time. Richard Tice doesn't have anywhere near the same amount of name recognition. And you ask people on the street who's the leader of Reform, they're the successor to the Brexit Party, and to UKIP, they'll probably say Nigel Farage. So we sort of reverted back to the norm.
What I think the really important aspect of this is, however, is how much the re-emergence in this form of Nigel Farage changes the rest of this strange election campaign. Because now he has made himself leader of his own party again. He will get the right to debate. He'll get a lot more broadcast attention. And I think one of the really interesting things is how do the big broadcasters, the BBC, Sky, ITN, react to Nigel Farage? Are they going to give him a sort of daily big platform? Is he going to become one of the dominant voices and figures of this election campaign? Because he is much more eloquent and much punchier than either Starmer or Sunak. And he keeps saying he wants an immigration election. Richard Tice said the same thing. We are going to have an immigration election. Is he able to get that now? And is that going to therefore change the entire tone of the campaign over the next 4 weeks?
And related to that, what role do you think, particularly the BBC as our sort of public service broadcaster, have in fact-checking? Live on air, but also subsequently some of Farage's statements that, obviously we had the events last week of one of the newsreaders being pulled up for saying that his language is inflammatory. That probably, that does cross the line for impartiality, but still,
I've had to deal with Nigel Farage across a TV set, and by far the best thing to do is to ask calm, factual questions and not get engaged in any to and forth. I did that with previous policies he had issued a few years ago, and he was so angry that he denounced me by name from a UKIP stage the day afterwards. I thought Michelle Hussein of the Today programme did a very, very good job. I think we all think about that. Again, asking calm, quiet, forensic questions, and that's the way to do it.
I completely agree, but I don't think that's going to work because Farage is an emotional, symbolic figure. He is positioning himself as the anti-establishment candidate. He is saying, and it resonates with people, that Starmer and Sunak are the same. They represent continuity, and I don't think Labour has helped themselves with this because they've moved so closely to the Conservatives. And Farage can make great headway with that. He doesn't need to have a very detailed policy on immigration to do that.
Completely right, and I think he will change the atmosphere of a future Labour government. If you look at the consequences, I've been writing about this week, the consequences of Labour having an absolutely massive majority. Does it give them, as one shadow cabinet minister said to me yesterday, does it give us the space, the political space to be more radical in power than we had intended to be? A really interesting question. But when it comes to immigration and migration and borders, then I think simply having Farage there as a leading opposition figure in Parliament on the television the whole time will make it even harder for Labour to liberalise immigration or to carry on with the relatively liberal migration system we've got. That said, of course, numbers are going to come down because of Ukraine and Hong Kong coming out of the figures.
So catastrophic for the Tories, this announcement for Farage, but it's not great for Labour.
No, it's not great for Labour at all. I think I've been speaking to some Labour people the past 2 days, and they were quite gleeful because they thought it would split the Tory vote, it would ensure that Sunak lost. And I think that's right. But as Farage said in his speech, this is about 5 years from now. It's not about politics today. It's not about the election in 5 weeks' time. It's about 5 years. And in 5 years' time, I think Labour are going to face a two-pronged threat, both from the left, and we're seeing the Greens coalesce at the moment and do a little bit better than we thought they would, and from reform.
Although not on their maternity policy, as I've written today.
I'm sure that'll get them.
Yeah.
Sure, that'll get them, yeah. Is it a coincidence that the Conservatives have gone full frontal, if you like, on immigration policy today, or is it just a coincidence of the timings?
I think right from the beginning of the campaign, I've been talking to people at the heart of the Labour campaign, and they think the same. Right from the beginning of the campaign, the first thing that the Tory tacticians were trying to do was to crush, pulverise the Reform vote, because they know perfectly well that if Reform holds up, then they are finished, they're toast. And I think in the first week, before the Farage announcement, that wasn't actually working. The Reform vote was holding up remarkably well, and then Farage comes in, and that means the Reform vote is not going to go anywhere anytime fast. And I do think this is game over for the Conservative Party. It's an existential moment for them in their current form. And, you know, this is becoming one of the most consequential elections of the last 40 years or 50 years. I think British politics this week changed for good.
Wow.
Sorry.
I mean, you said that. You said that the day we kicked off, that people were underestimating how important this election is.
I mean, I think we are, picking up what Freddie was saying, I think we are going to see a long period now of Labour Party in power. I think they're probably going to get themselves 10 years, not 5. We can't tell what's going to happen. And they're going to be very unpopular for a while because stuff will happen. They have tied their hands very, very tightly on tax and borrowing. I think they're going to have to loosen those bounds. And they're going to be hit by big events from overseas, and it's going to be very tough for them. But they're going to be facing not the Conservative Party as we have known it, but a much more right-wing, in some respects a darker, more nationalist kind of politics to their right. And I think, you know, we have been sitting in Britain observing the continent of Maloney and Le Pen and Geert Wilders and all those characters with a slightly sort of, you know, arms folded, aren't we doing better atmosphere. We are now part of that world, and I think that's what's changed.
So just on that, Farage was supposed to go to America this autumn to cover the election, to help Trump, to be his front man, his Brexit man, as he calls him. That was the original plan, and then he obviously saw a gap in the market. He saw that the fractures of British politics were such that he could enter. But it tells you so much about his politics and how he sees the world that he was in Brussels in April at the National Conservative Conference, and I was there, and he was just this happy guy because the police turned up and it proved his point. And he spends all his time in America. And I think you're right, Andrew. The UK at the moment has been this readout for sort of centre-left politics in the Western world, and some people are now questioning that. I think the electorate, though, are not yet there, and that's why it's important we say it's in 5 years, it's not now. At the moment, the electorate are focused on the economy, the NHS. They're not focused on guns, abortion. They are focused a bit about immigration, but it's not dominating everything. So we have to wait and see where they go. Do they move towards Farage? Is he able to shift the debate towards him or not?
What explains why we at the moment at least, appear to be a bit of an outlier in Europe, do you think?
But it's really interesting, isn't it? Because when I was a little bit younger, British commentators, British politicians of the centre-left would look at the EU and regard it as a kind of safe haven for sort of civilised, liberal, Enlightenment values. We can no longer say that. It wasn't because we left the EU, but at the same time as we did leave the EU, a lot of these nationalist and right-wing and populist authoritarian parties, however you describe them, Orban and the rest of it, began to get traction. And we're seeing it in the United States as well. There is a kind of movement right across what used to be called the West of authoritarian nationalist populism. I think it's just it's the rhythm of events and it's the chance of politics, as it were, plus our electoral system, which has prevented a right-wing breakthrough party until now.
And I also think it's Brexit. Brexit fractured the British right in a way that hasn't happened in Europe. There's many divides in Europe, then they don't get on and they disagree about many, many things. But Brexit was so fundamental and it's dominated the conversation for so long that I don't think this nationalist right was able to rise.
The Conservatives today are very much focusing on immigration, trying to stop the hemorrhage to reform perhaps. But is it going to make any difference? They're pledging a cap, and each of the next 5 years, they say that cap will be a lower number. This is obviously for legal migration.
Yeah,
but we've seen under their watch that they're not. It's the highest it's ever been.
We should point out that for demographic and economic reasons, the more you keep a cap on legal migration, that has a huge impact on public spending. It raises the cost of salaries across the care sector, for instance, in the NHS. So it's an expensive policy in cash terms. And of course, it's a policy which is never going to resolve the people who hate it most, because until you stop black and brown people coming into this country at all and get rid of some of the ones who are here, then some of those people who are angriest are never going to be happy.
But just on Labour, I think this is a clear dividing line with Labour, because they don't have a cap. They've said they wanted to bring immigration down. Keir Starmer had that over the weekend. He's spoken in the past about this immigration dependency. They abide by some of the arguments, but there is a split within the party. If you speak to some of the shadow cabinet, they're very pro-migration, just on a matter of principle. They like diversity. They think it's good for the economy. They think it's healthy for democracy. So I think that split will probably be accentuated by this Tory policy, but also by reform.
I think that's absolutely right. But I think the crunch point goes back to economics and goes back to the effect of a really tight migration cap on growth. I mean, Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer say the very first thing that they want to achieve, the most important thing, without which they can do nothing, is return to growth. Now, if you keep a really tight cap on migration, then growth is not going to come back, not for quite a few years. And I think that's where the big arguments are going to be.
Just on that growth point, because it is key. I thought it was very interesting. I pressed Labour's and Rachel Reeves' team on this for a while. They've been quite clear that their policy that they want to achieve the highest growth within the G7 is GDP per capita, which is interesting because when you look at the OBR report, the most recent one, and the impact of immigration on the economy, it says, of course, the more people you have, the higher economic growth you have.
But not per capita.
But not per capita.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make that much of a difference. In fact, GDP per capita growth in the past 3 years has declined. It's been negative. So that's a problem for them.
But taking both main parties, I mean, firstly, two questions really. How important is immigration to the electorate? Secondly, are either of them trusted to get immigration down if that is what the electorate want?
Just in terms of the sheer polling, it's number 3
right,
in terms of voters' concerns. It comes behind the economy and it becomes behind the NHS. But number 3 is pretty high.
Yeah.
And I think, I struggle to be absolutely accurate about this, but I think in previous elections, going back a few years, it'd be about number 5 or 6. So it's come right up. It is a really salient issue, even before Farage entered the campaign in this particular way.
Just on immigration, I always find that if you look at the polling over the past 20, 30, 40 years, around 50 to 60% of people want fewer immigrants coming into the country. That's sort of always the case. What changes is the salience of the issue. It moves up and down that priority list. And I think at the moment, even though it went down after Brexit a little bit, when people felt we had a bit more control, and that issue was done, and now it's going back up. And that will be a problem. I think it will define politics in 5 years. We're not there yet, but it's coming.
And this is partly about the optics as well, because, all those years where we had a lot of illegal migration coming in lorries, and they were parking up in industrial sites, industrial estates around the southeast of England, and people were hopping off the back and getting into taxis. Nobody talked about it much. It's the pictures of people coming across in boats onto beaches that has the big emotional impact.
You've already touched on it, Andrew, but you've talked about the economic consequences of limiting migration, being that, it's expensive. And this is something that the Lib Dems have been the first, I think, of the three main parties this campaign so far to talk about social care. Ed Davey today pledging that there'll be free personal care for adults in need, including the elderly and the disabled. Very emotional listening to Sir Ed Davey. His son requires 24-hour care. It's obviously something that deeply impacts him personally. Yesterday, Kemi Badenoch was asked about social care on Times Radio, didn't appreciate being asked about that, said it's not her brief. The two main parties have avoided this, haven't they? But this is something that has to be tackled, and it has to be done on a bipartisan nature. I mean, why are they so frightened of tackling this?
Hannah, it is shameful.
It is.
And it's not the only aspect under which this election is trivial and sort of failing to match the challenges the country faces. But it's certainly one of the examples. The reason they're scared of it is they all remember Theresa May and the dementia tax and the way that election campaign ran off the rails. But the problem with social care, as we all know, is that at some point somebody is going to have to pay the salaries of all the new people who are going to have to come into the sector to create proper social care, to unblock the hospitals and get the NHS waiting lists down. Everybody knows this, but nobody wants to take money away from the NHS to pay for social care. Nobody wants to raise general taxation to pay for social care. There have been various ideas in the past about a special social care related impost of some kind, but that's been rejected. And so the reason they're not talking about it is that they don't actually have any kind of answers.
Is there any prospect of actually the politicians, the next cohort who are elected, being grown up about this and saying, we need a cross-party consensus here? It's whoever is in power, it's going to cost a fortune, but it needs to be done.
Yeah, I think we keep being told that the group of people who're most inclined to vote and therefore most influential in politics are pensioners and older voters, the same people who are presumably looking ahead wondering about their own social care. And so it is illogical in a sense that it isn't higher up the agenda, and you kind of hope that it will become so. I think it's when the boomer generation starts to realise that they can't afford to pay for their parents and they can't afford to pay for their own social care and start to panic that it'll become a bigger social issue.
But we're getting pretty close to that, aren't we?
Very close.
Just on the frivolity of the campaign, it is interesting how condensed and distilled the debates become. Just take, for instance, Rachel Reeves's comments about the GB Energy or their economic transformative plan. It used to be, we're going to have a Green New Deal to bring jobs and prosperity. Then it became, okay, well, we're just going to set up this GB Energy thing. Now it's our economic programme is stability, and that's it. It's just reduced. It's got smaller and smaller and smaller and less significant. And I think that's partly because they're doing so well in the polls. Labour don't need to take any risks, and that's why they're not doing it. Maybe that'll change with the debate tonight, but I'm sceptical. And I think the problem, therefore, is that we're not having these more substantive conversations and debates about things like social care.
It's as if the entire political ecosystem is just terrified to talk about the truth surrounding the country. Our growth is too small, our economy is too small to give ourselves the kind of welfare and public realm we think we somehow deserve, and yet nobody is prepared to cut through that. And I think it is dishonest and ridiculous and shameful that both the main parties say they're going to cut taxes and they're not going to borrow any more at a time when they don't know what the next shock's going to be. They don't know whether Putin is going to break through in Ukraine or attack Lithuania or whatever. They don't know if there's another pandemic coming. How can they possibly make these promises with a straight face?
And it's very infantilising as well. I actually think that the electorate would probably appreciate being told the truth about where we're at.
Yeah, I'm not
sure. I'm not sure, Hannah.
No, but I mean, it's better to under-promise and over-deliver, isn't it?
Sure.
Than
but there is a narrative in this general election that's built. I think Trevor Phillips said it on Sunday. He said, there's a fact here about this election, there is no money. Which I find a ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous thing to say. That's just not true. It's not true at all. Labour, if they want money, can go and get money. They can raise taxes. I mean, the whole policy to say we aren't going to raise taxes is a choice not to raise money. They can look at wealth taxes, they can look at income taxes, they can look at VAT. There is lots of money. I think the media constantly accept that narrative just because they've accepted the Tories and the Labour's fiscal rules, which is ridiculous.
We'll obviously dissect this more in detail tomorrow, but looking ahead to the big event tonight, the first head-to-head, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer in a live debate. Any predictions?
I think Starmer will be very, very cautious. He will look more like a leader than Sunak, because on television he just does. Sunak will be coming at him very, very hard about what he said during the Corbyn years, trying to tie him as hard as possible to Corbyn, and Starmer needs to have a really good response to that. I think one of the things that Starmer will be going for Sunak on is Sunak's own future. He can say to him, in effect, look, whoever you are, what we know and you know and everybody watching knows and the cat knows is that if by some mischance you won this election, you would not be Prime Minister for long because the Tory party, would come after you. Somebody else will, you're addicted to regicide in your party. It's going to be voting for more chaos, more change, more turmoil. And I think that would be a strong argument for him to use because it's true. However, the other thing to say is that in these debates, the front runner is always at a disadvantage. These debates only have an effect when the person in the second position actually changes the weather a bit, and that is Sunak's chance tonight. He's quite a good debate. He's quite feisty in the House of Commons. He punches quite hard, so it'll be a really, really interesting contest.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've seen PMQs every single week. We've seen them debate already. We know what they're going to be like in some respects, and you're right, Rishi Sunak does sometimes have good weeks. So I don't think it'll be dissimilar to that. I do think it might be disappointing because Keir Starmer is going to be quite defensive and no one listens to Rishi Sunak. So whatever Rishi might say, people will go, well, we've heard that all before, and Keir Starmer doesn't need to take any risks.
Will there have been any last-minute shift in strategy because of the Farage announcement?
As we sit here, they will be sitting, working out exactly what to say about Farage. They'll be game planning again and again. They'll be testing lines. They'll be testing phrases to use about him. How dismissive to be, how welcoming to sound to the kind of people he's also trying to attract, all of that. So it's going on right now. I have a sort of sneaking admiration in a funny way for Rishi Sunak because he never, ever gives up. He's like one of those Jack Russell Terriers which never shuts up. He's constantly yapping, constantly moving. And whatever you say is never quite discouraged.
I think he gave up by calling the election.
I think a lot of people would agree with that, yeah.
Well, we will no doubt analyse the words and actions of both men tomorrow.